Have you ever given someone everything, only to have them turn around and claim you gave them nothing at all? Have you ever worked yourself to the bone, not for praise, but to build a life, a shared life, only to be told your work was a weapon you used against your family?
I have.
My name is Dr. Ivy Reed, and I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon. For 10 years, I was also a wife. I thought I was a partner, but in the end, I learned I was just a bank. And when my husband decided he was done with the marriage, he didn't just walk away. He tried to walk away with my future. He served me with divorce papers, demanding half of my surgeon's salary and alimony, painting himself as the victim, a man who had sacrificed his own brilliant career for my ambition. He and his lawyer had crafted a beautiful, tragic story. There was just one problem. They had forgotten about the story I had written myself. Years ago, a single, obscure clause in a document he had long since forgotten. They thought they were taking me to court for a settlement. They had no idea I was taking them to court to hand them a bill. This is the story of how I stopped funding a lie and made my husband pay for the truth. The papers arrived on a Tuesday. Not just any Tuesday, but the Tuesday after a grueling 36-hour shift, the kind that leaves your bones aching and your brain feeling like a wad of damp cotton. I had just finished a complex valve replacement on a patient who probably wouldn't have made it through the night. I was running on fumes and the dregs of lukewarm coffee, but I felt that specific, exhausted satisfaction that comes from pulling someone back from the brink. I was walking out of the hospital, the cool evening air a balm on my tired face, dreaming of a hot shower and 8 hours of blessed sleep, when I saw him. Julian, my husband. He was leaning against my car, a brand new Mercedes I'd bought myself for my 40th birthday, the one he'd said was a bit ostentatious. He was dressed impeccably, of course. A crisp linen shirt, tailored trousers, shoes that cost more than my first set of textbooks. He looked rested. He looked relaxed. He looked, I realized with a sudden cold jolt, like a man without a single care in the world. He smiled as I approached, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was a smugness to it, a practiced sort of pity that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. He said my name, Ivy, in that smooth, placid tone he used when he was about to tell me the caterer had mixed up the wine order or that his golf foursome had been rescheduled. It was the tone of minor inconveniences. He held out a thick manila envelope. I just stared at it. I was too tired to process this strange tableau in the hospital parking garage. He sighed, a theatrical sound of long-suffering patience. He told me he was sorry it had to be this way, that he'd hoped we could handle this like adults, but I was just never available. The words, so calm and reasonable, were a slap. Never available. I'd just spent the last day and a half with my hands literally inside another human being's chest, and I was never available. I took the envelope. My hands, the hands that could suture a human heart, felt clumsy and numb. I didn't open it. I didn't have to. I knew what it was. It was the end. He said his lawyer, a man named Garrett Shaw, would be in touch with my lawyer to work out the details. He used the word amicably. He said he wished me well. He truly did. Then he turned, walked to the Uber that had been waiting for him at the curb and disappeared. He didn't even look back. I stood there for what felt like an hour, the envelope in my hand, the hum of the garage's fluorescent lights buzzing in my ears. The weight of it wasn't in the paper. It was in the casual cruelty of the delivery. He hadn't done this at home, in the privacy of the life I had built for us. He had done it here, at my sanctuary, my place of purpose, as if to remind me that the very thing he was about to punish me for was the source of my identity. When I finally got home, the apartment was silent. It was always silent now, unless Julian was hosting one of his networking lunches. The space was beautiful, a sprawling penthouse overlooking the city, with floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture he had picked out from a design magazine. I had hated it on sight. It felt like a hotel lobby, cold and impersonal. But Julian had insisted it was the kind of place a woman of my stature should live in. A woman of my stature. As if I were a monument and not a person. I walked through the rooms, and for the first time I didn't see our home. I saw a stage, a set for the life of a man of leisure. His custom-built humidor for his Cuban cigars sat on the marble countertop. His collection of single malt scotches, each bottle costing a small fortune, lined a bespoke bar cart. His golf clubs, the latest model of course, were propped by the door, ready for his morning game. My contribution to the decor was a stack of medical journals on my nightstand and the faint, persistent smell of antiseptic that clung to my scrubs. I finally sat down on the edge of our bed, the bed I mostly slept in alone, and opened the envelope. The legal jargon was dense, but the message was brutally simple. Julian Croft was filing for divorce from Dr. Ivy Reed on the grounds of irreconcilable differences. And then came the part that made the air leave my lungs. He was demanding permanent spousal support, alimony, 50% of my after-tax income. The justification, as laid out by his lawyer in prose so purple it was practically bleeding, was that Julian had made the profound personal and professional sacrifice of placing his own burgeoning career as a high-level consultant on hold to support the demanding, all-consuming nature of Dr. Reed's professional calling. It went on like that for pages. It painted him as a martyr, the silent, steadfast partner who managed their domestic and social lives so that I could be free to save the world. It described his emotional labor, his unwavering support, his foregone opportunities. It was a work of fiction so audacious, so completely divorced from reality, that for a moment I felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. He had forgotten. He had actually truly forgotten that he hadn't worked a day in 5 years because he had been laid off and was too proud to take a job he felt was beneath him. He had forgotten the nights I came home to find him 3 glasses of wine deep, complaining about the job market, then complaining about the dinner I was too tired to cook. He had forgotten that his consulting consisted of calling our financial advisor, my financial advisor, to move money around for his latest investment, which was usually a case of ridiculously expensive Bordeaux. The breakdown, when it came, wasn't loud. It was a quiet internal collapse. I sat there on the edge of the bed, the legal papers sliding from my lap onto the floor, and I finally let the full weight of the last 5 years crash down on me. The exhaustion I felt wasn't just from the 36-hour shift. It was a soul-deep weariness that had been accumulating for years. I had been carrying him. I had been carrying his ego, his insecurities, his lifestyle, his profound and bottomless sense of entitlement, and I had done it willingly at first, because I loved him. I thought back to the beginning, to the man I had fallen in love with. We met at a fundraiser. I was a resident, drowning in debt and caffeine, and he was a rising star at a major consulting firm. He was magnetic. He had this incredible energy, a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. He was fascinated by my work, he said. He loved my passion, my drive. We were a power couple, he joked, the surgeon and the strategist. And for a while we were. Those early years were a blur of 80-hour work weeks for me and long-haul flights for him. We were 2 ambitious people carving out our space in the world, and we were doing it together. We were a team. When my career started to take off, when I was offered a fellowship and then an attending position at one of the best hospitals in the country, he was my biggest cheerleader. He's the one who encouraged me to take the job, even though it meant uprooting our lives and moving to Chicago. He said he'd find something new, something even better. He was Julian Croft, after all. Opportunities followed him. The first crack appeared about a year after we moved. His firm went through a major restructuring. His entire division was eliminated. He was given a generous severance package, but he was laid off. I came home from a 12-hour shift to find him sitting in the dark, staring out the window. He was devastated, but his pride, that massive fragile thing, wouldn't let him call it what it was. He told me he'd been thinking. He said maybe this was a sign. My career was so demanding, so all-consuming, maybe it was time for him to take a step back, to be the support system for a while. He framed it as a choice, a noble sacrifice. He wasn't unemployed, he was repositioning himself as the CEO of our lives. And I, filled with love and a healthy dose of guilt for my constant absences, I believed him. Or I wanted to. It was easier to see him as a noble martyr than as a man who had just been fired. I told him to take his time, to find the perfect fit. I told him not to worry about money. That was my first mistake. The first 6 months were plausible. He networked. He took exploratory lunches. He put out feelers. He redesigned his resume and updated his LinkedIn profile a dozen times. But the perfect fit never seemed to materialize. One job was too much travel. Another didn't have the right title. A third had a corporate culture that was stifling. Slowly, imperceptibly, the job search tapered off. The networking lunches became actual lunches with his friends. Putting out feelers became a weekly golf game. His new project became remodeling the kitchen, a project for which he hired a team of contractors and designers that I, of course, paid for. His title changed from unemployed to independent consultant. When our friends would ask what he did, he would give a vague, charming answer about managing a private portfolio of interests. It was a lie, but it was a lie we both tacitly agreed to uphold. It was the price of peace. It was the cost of protecting his ego. The argument started small. I'd come home, bone-tired, and he'd be complaining about the stock market or the subpar quality of the new cashmere sweaters he'd ordered online. I'd gently suggest he look at a few job postings I'd found, and he'd get defensive. He would accuse me of not appreciating his contribution. He'd say things like, "Do you have any idea how much work it is to manage this household, to maintain our social standing?" And I would just stop. I didn't have the energy to fight. It was easier to just wire more money into our joint account and go to bed. I was enabling him. I see that now. My passivity was a form of poison, slowly eroding the foundations of our marriage. Why did I wait so long? Why did I put up with it for 5 years? It's a question I've asked myself 1,000 times. The only answer I have is that it happened slowly. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, 1,000 small compromises and capitulations until I woke up one day and realized the man I had married was gone, replaced by this pampered, resentful stranger who used my credit card to buy designer clothes in which to sit around our apartment and feel sorry for himself. The lawyer's letter was the thing that finally woke me up. It was the audacity of it, the sheer, unmitigated gall of claiming victimhood. He wasn't just asking for a share of our assets, he was asking for a permanent lien on my future. He wanted to sit back and collect a check for the rest of his life, a reward for the sacrifice of not working. And that was the moment my sadness curdled into something else. It was a cold, quiet anger that settled deep in my gut. The years of wariness fell away, replaced by a sudden, diamond-hard clarity. He thought he was divorcing a tired, guilt-ridden workaholic who would roll over and pay any price for a quiet life. He was about to find out he was divorcing a surgeon, someone who knew how to be precise, methodical, and how to cut out a sickness before it killed the patient. It wasn't about revenge until it was. That night, sitting in the dark in that cold, sterile apartment, I didn't cry. I started to plan. And my first thought was of a conversation I'd had 10 years ago in another lawyer's office, a conversation that Julian had laughed off and long since forgotten. I remembered the day we signed the prenup as if it were yesterday. It was my father's idea. My dad, a self-made man who'd built a construction empire from nothing, was practical to a fault. He adored Julian's charm, but didn't trust it. "Ivy," he'd said to me, his voice rough but kind, "love is for the heart, a contract is for the head. You need to protect your head." Julian had been deeply offended. He'd made a grand speech about love and trust. How could I even think of implying that our marriage was a business transaction? He saw it as an insult to his character. I, caught between the two men I loved, wanted to smooth it all over. But for once my father wouldn't budge. He said if I wanted his blessing, I needed to get the prenup. So I agreed. We met with my family's lawyer, a woman named Eleanor Vance. She was the polar opposite of my father, cool, elegant, and precise, where he was bluff and hearty. She wore steel gray suits and had a mind like a scalpel. She drafted a standard prenuptial agreement, protecting the assets I had coming into the marriage, primarily a trust fund my grandparents had set up for my education. Julian was still sulking, but he agreed to the basic terms. Then, as we were about to wrap up, Eleanor paused. She looked at me over the top of her glasses. "Dr. Reed," she said, "you are at the beginning of a very lucrative and very demanding career. Your future earnings will likely be your most significant marital asset." She then turned her gaze to Julian, who was looking impatient. "And Mr. Croft, you are also in a competitive field, but things change." She then proposed a new clause, an unusual one. She called it the Lifestyle Continuity and Voluntary Unemployment Addendum. The language was dense, but the gist was this: in the event of a divorce, if one spouse had been voluntarily unemployed for a period of more than 24 consecutive months, that spouse would automatically forfeit any and all claims to alimony or spousal support. But that wasn't the part that made Julian laugh out loud. The second part was the hammer. It stated that if, during the 3 years preceding the divorce filing, the voluntarily unemployed spouse's lifestyle had been funded exclusively by the earning spouse, then the earning spouse had the right to retroactively calculate a lifestyle stipend. This stipend, essentially the cost of the unemployed spouse's non-essential living expenses, could be levied as a debt and paid back from their share of any divided marital assets. Julian actually chuckled. He looked at me, incredulous. "A lifestyle stipend? You mean I'd have to pay you back for golf games and nice dinners? Ellie, that's absurd." He called her Ellie. She did not look amused. "I'm a consultant, one of the best. The idea that I would be voluntarily unemployed is ridiculous." He signed it with a flourish, as if to show how little he thought of it. But I remember what Eleanor said to me quietly, as Julian was gathering his things. She said, "It's not for the man you're marrying today, Dr. Reed. It's for the man he might become in 10 years. Her words had been a prophecy. The morning after I received Julian's papers, the first call I made was to Eleanor Vance. Her number was still saved in my phone, under lawyer. I hadn't spoken to her in a decade. Her assistant put me through immediately. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it, calm, cool, and utterly unflappable. "Dr. Reed," she said, without a hint of surprise, "I must admit, I've been waiting for this call for about 3 years now." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I explained the situation, the papers, the demand for 50% of my salary. I could almost hear her smiling on the other end of the line. "Ivy," she said, and her use of my first name was a comfort. "Let him ask. Let his lawyer write all the purple prose he wants. They are playing checkers in a park. We are about to play chess in a war room." We met the next day. Her office was a fortress of mahogany and leather-bound books. I handed her the papers from Julian's lawyer. She read them, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she took off her glasses and set them down on the desk. "A work of pure fiction," she said. "He's positioning himself as a 1950s housewife. It's a bold strategy. It's also monumentally stupid." She pulled out our file, a thick, dusty folder. Inside, pristine and waiting, was the original copy of the prenup. She tapped the lifestyle stipend clause with a perfectly manicured finger. "This," she said, "is our entire strategy. We don't defend. We don't negotiate. We attack." Her plan was simple and brutal. First, we had to prove that Julian's unemployment was voluntary. His histrionics about sacrificing his career were a direct attempt to negate this. We needed more than my word against his. We needed proof. "He thinks his narrative is the only one that will be told in court," Eleanor explained. "We need to build a counter-narrative, one made of receipts, emails, and verifiable facts. We need to show that he didn't sacrifice a career. He chose a life of leisure on your dime." She recommended we hire a private investigator, a man named Marcus Thorne. She described him as discreet, thorough, and completely without sentiment. He was perfect. That's when the subplot of my divorce began. The secret investigation into my own husband's life. Marcus was a former cop, a big, gruff man who looked more like a bouncer than a detective. He communicated mostly through grunts and brief, typewritten reports that he would email me at the end of each day. It was a sordid, ugly process. I felt a wave of shame as I signed the check to pay for his retainer. I was hiring a spy to follow the man I had once promised to love and honor. But the shame was quickly replaced by a cold, surgical necessity. This was a procedure, an extraction of a truth that had been buried under years of lies. Marcus was, as Eleanor had promised, thorough. He started with the basics, documenting Julian's daily routine. The reports were a monotonous litany of my husband's idleness. 9:30 a.m., arrived at Oak Ridge Country Club, 1:45 p.m., lunch at the club's grill, with 2 unidentified males, 4:30 p.m., departed country club, 5 p.m., arrived at the wine cask for a tasting event, and so on, day after day. Marcus attached photographs. Julian laughing on the golf course, Julian swirling a glass of wine, Julian lounging by the pool. Each picture was a small stab of confirmation. This was his life, this was his sacrifice, and I was paying for every minute of it. The club membership, the lunches, the wine, it all went on the joint credit card that was linked to my bank account. But the real bombshell came about 2 weeks into the investigation. Marcus, using a subpoena Eleanor, had managed to get expedited, had gained access to Julian's email and server records from the past few years. He was looking for evidence of a job search. He found the opposite. He found 2 separate, formal job offers. The first was from a major competitor of his old firm, a position as a senior partner with a salary that would have nearly matched my own. Julian had turned it down. Marcus had the email chain. Julian's reply to the CEO was a masterpiece of condescending evasion. "Thank you for the generous offer," he had written. "However, at this stage in my life, I am prioritizing a more flexible work-life integration. My current consulting endeavors allow me to pursue a more holistic approach to my professional portfolio." It was corporate speak for "I'd rather play golf." The second offer was even more damning. It was from a smaller boutique firm, but the position was solid and the pay was excellent. He had gone through 3 rounds of interviews. They clearly wanted him. His rejection this time was even more insulting. He had written back, "After careful consideration, I've decided that the corporate culture at your firm is not aligned with my personal brand." His personal brand. His personal brand was unemployed freeloader. These emails were the smoking gun. They were irrefutable proof that his unemployment was not a sacrifice, not a consequence of a bad market, but a deliberate choice. He hadn't been forced out of the workforce. He had opted out. While Marcus was digging up the proof, Eleanor was doing the accounting. She had me gather every credit card statement, every bank transfer, every receipt for the last 3 years. She and her forensic accounting team went through them with a fine-toothed comb. They isolated every one of Julian's personal expenses. The club memberships, the $500 sweaters, the trip to Aspen with his buddies, the investment wines, the redecorating fees, the weekly massages. The bill was astronomical. As the number climbed, I felt a strange sense of detachment. It wasn't about the money anymore. Each receipt, each charge, was a small piece of evidence in the case against the man he had become. It was the price tag of his lie. The final tally, when Eleanor presented it to me, was just shy of $750,000. That was the bill I was going to present him with in court. That was the cost of his 3-year vacation. The lifestyle stipend. The first move in our chess game came from his lawyer, Garrett Shaw. He sent Eleanor an email with their official settlement proposal. It was even more insulting than the initial filing. He demanded the full 50% alimony for life, plus the penthouse apartment, the Mercedes, and half of my investment portfolio. He attached a 2-page letter, a hagiography of St. Julian the Martyr, detailing again his immeasurable contributions to our marriage. He clearly thought he was dealing with a walkover, that I'd be so desperate to avoid a messy public divorce that I'd cave. He expected a counteroffer, the start of a negotiation. Eleanor, following my instructions, replied with 2 words. Proposal rejected. No explanation, no counteroffer, just a flat, cold denial. The silence that followed was deafening. A week went by. Garrett Shaw, clearly unnerved, called Eleanor's office. He was blustering, arrogant. He told her she was doing her client a disservice, that my reputation as a surgeon wouldn't survive the public airing of my marital neglect. He threatened to subpoena my colleagues, to paint me as an emotionally distant work-obsessed monster who had abandoned her loving husband. Eleanor listened patiently. When he was done with his tirade, she simply said, "Garrett, if you wish to embarrass your client by pursuing this ridiculous claim, be my guest. We will see you at the preliminary hearing." And she hung up. That's when Julian started contacting me directly. The man who couldn't be bothered to have a single difficult conversation with me during our marriage was now blowing up my phone. The texts were a masterclass in manipulation, a desperate, flailing attempt to find a weakness. He started with nostalgia. Pictures of us from our honeymoon in Italy, with a caption, "Remember how happy we were before your job took over our lives." I didn't respond. Then came the guilt. "I know you're angry, Ivy, but do you really want to tear everything down over money, after all I did to support you?" I deleted the message. His tone then shifted to righteous indignation. "I can't believe you're being so cold. I gave you the best years of my life. I deserve some consideration." Each message was a new performance, a new mask he was trying on to see which one would work: the supportive husband, the wounded lover, the indignant victim. I followed Eleanor's advice to the letter. I blocked his number. I set up a rule in my email to send anything from him directly to a folder that I shared with her. I refused to engage. My silence was a vacuum, and it was driving him insane. He was used to controlling the narrative, to charming or bullying his way to a win. For the first time, he was met with a wall of absolute indifference. His panic was palpable, even from a distance. He started making mistakes. He called up some of our mutual friends, trying to get them on his side, feeding them his sob story. But these were people who knew us. They were my colleagues, other doctors who understood the demands of the job. They had been to our apartment for dinner parties and seen me cook the meal after a 14-hour day, while Julian explained the tasting notes of the wine he'd selected. His campaign for sympathy backfired spectacularly. He wasn't gathering allies. He was alienating the few people who were still willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. He was isolating himself, one desperate phone call at a time. The silent takeover was working. He was used to being the center of attention, the charming protagonist of his own story. He had no idea how to operate when the spotlight was turned off. The power shift became undeniable about a month before the first court date. Julian, in a desperate attempt to shore up his crumbling social standing, decided to host a dinner party. He invited a few couples who he still considered his friends, people who were more his acquaintances than mine. Among them was Lena, one of my oldest friends from medical school, and her husband. Lena was a pediatrician, sharp as a tack, and with a finely tuned nonsense detector. Julian, I later learned, had invited her in a misguided attempt to show that he still had a connection to my world, that we were still a community. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Lena told me the story a few days later over coffee, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and righteous fury. Apparently, Julian had spent the entire evening playing the role of the tragic hero. He sighed dramatically. He spoke in hushed, pained tones about how difficult it was to support a spouse with such a monumental career. He kept using the word sacrifice like a mantra. He talked about the promising career path he had walked away from for the sake of our marriage. He was laying it on so thick, Lena said. You could have spread it on toast. Most of the guests, being his sycophants, just nodded along, murmuring sympathetic platitudes. But Lena had reached her limit. During a lull in the conversation, after Julian had just finished a long, rambling monologue about turning down a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to stay home and manage the domestic infrastructure. Lena set down her wine glass. She looked him dead in the eye. "Julian," she said, her voice dangerously calm, "I'm a little confused. Are you talking about the partner track job at McKinley Consulting? The one you told my husband you turned down because you didn't want to commute 40 minutes and you felt the health benefits weren't up to your standards?" The silence that fell over the dinner table, Lena said, was absolute. Julian's face went from piously sad to stark white in a matter of seconds. He started to stammer, to bluster, something about a misunderstanding, that the situation was more complex. But the damage was done. Lena had just detonated a truth bomb in the middle of his pity party. The carefully constructed facade of his sacrifice had been shattered by a single inconvenient fact. The dinner party broke up shortly after that. The social exodus had begun. The people he relied on to validate his narrative were now looking at him with suspicion. He wasn't the martyr. He was the man who was too lazy to drive to work. His desperation, now curdled into pure panic, led him to his most pathetic and insulting ploy. 2 weeks before the court date, Eleanor received a letter from Garrett Shaw. It was a motion to postpone the hearing. The reason? Julian had suddenly developed a mysterious medical condition. It was a debilitating stress-induced neurological disorder, the letter claimed, that left him unable to withstand the rigors of a court proceeding. It also, conveniently, made him unfit for any form of employment. Attached was a note from a doctor I had never heard of, filled with vague terminology about chronic fatigue and cognitive fog. I read the letter, and I didn't feel anger. I felt a profound, bottomless contempt. He was trying to use my own profession against me. He was weaponizing the language of medicine, a language I had dedicated my life to further his lazy, pathetic grift. He thought I, a surgeon who diagnoses life and death conditions every single day, would be fooled by this transparent nonsense. It was the final insult. I called Eleanor immediately. "I want you to investigate this doctor," I said, my voice cold and steady. "I want to know everything about him." Eleanor, being Eleanor, was already on it. It took her team less than a day to get the full picture. The doctor, a man named Alistair Finch, was a notorious quack for hire. He had a reputation in the legal community for providing medical excuses for a hefty fee. He had been sanctioned twice by the state medical board for unethical practices. He was, in short, a professional liar. Eleanor's investigator even managed to get a sworn affidavit from a disgruntled former employee of his who confirmed that Finch would write any diagnosis a client wanted as long as their check cleared. It was a desperate, foolish gambit, and it was the last nail in his coffin. He wasn't just a liar. He was a cheat willing to suborn medical fraud to get what he wanted. My resolve, which I thought could not get any harder, solidified into something akin to granite. I was no longer just defending myself. I was going to dismantle him. The day of the hearing arrived. I walked into the courtroom feeling strangely calm. The anxiety and anger that had been my constant companions for months had evaporated, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. Julian was already there, sitting next to his lawyer. He was putting on a masterful performance. He looked pale and drawn. He held his head in his hands, as if in pain. He was the very picture of a suffering victim. Garrett Shaw, his lawyer, was buzzing with a smarmy, misplaced confidence. He clearly thought his client's last-minute illness had given them the upper hand. He probably imagined I'd see my sick husband and be flooded with guilt and pity. He didn't know me at all. When the proceedings began, Garrett Shaw launched into his opening statement. It was the same narrative he had been pushing all along, but now with an added layer of medical drama. He spoke of Julian's fragile health, brought on by the immense stress of a broken marriage and the emotional toll of his wife's abandonment. He painted a picture of me as a cold, unfeeling careerist who had not only neglected her husband, but had driven him to a state of physical collapse. He talked about Julian's noble sacrifice, how he had given up a skyrocketing career to be my support system. And what was his reward for this devotion? Garrett asked the judge, his voice dripping with faux pathos. To be cast aside, his health in tatters, with nothing to show for a decade of unwavering loyalty. All he asks for is what is fair. A measure of security, the means to live with dignity. It was nauseating. I looked at the judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s named Judge Miller. Her expression was impassive. Then it was Eleanor's turn. She stood up, a picture of calm, professional competence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't resort to theatrics. She just spoke the truth. "Your Honor," she began, "Mr. Shaw has painted a very compelling, very tragic portrait of his client. It's a shame that it bears absolutely no resemblance to the facts." And then, one by one, she began to dismantle Julian's entire story. She started with the job offers. She submitted the emails into evidence, Julian's own words in his own emails, turning down 2 lucrative high-level positions. "This is not a man who sacrificed a career, Your Honor. This is a man who actively chose not to work." She moved on to his lifestyle. She presented the mountain of evidence Marcus had gathered. The country club statements, the receipts for $1,000 dinners, the photographs of him on the golf course, on ski trips, at wine tastings, all taking place during standard business hours. "This is not the life of a man providing domestic infrastructure," Eleanor stated coolly. "This is the life of a man on a permanent, all-expenses-paid vacation, funded entirely by his wife." Julian had sunk lower in his chair. His pale, pained expression had been replaced by a look of sheer, slack-jawed panic. Garrett Shaw was shuffling his papers, his smug confidence gone. Eleanor saved the best for last. "And as for Mr. Croft's recent and very convenient medical diagnosis," she said, "we have here a sworn affidavit from a former employee of his physician, Dr. Alistair Finch, detailing a pattern of medical fraud. We also have records from the State Medical Board, which has sanctioned Dr. Finch twice for unethical practices." She placed the documents on the judge's bench. The final piece of his fiction had been exposed as a cheap lie, and then came the moment I had been waiting for. "Your Honor," Eleanor said, her voice dropping slightly, "Mr. Croft is demanding 50% of my client's future income. However, there is the matter of the prenuptial agreement, which both parties signed 10 years ago." She introduced the document. She directed the judge's attention to the lifestyle continuity and voluntary unemployment addendum. She read the clause aloud, her voice clear and steady in the silent courtroom. She explained that since Julian had been voluntarily unemployed for 5 years, he had forfeited any claim to alimony. And then she delivered the final blow. "Furthermore, Your Honor, as per the terms of the agreement he himself signed, my client is exercising her right to levy a lifestyle stipend against Mr. Croft for the past 3 years of his unemployment." She turned and nodded to me. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single bound document. I handed it to the court clerk. "We have prepared an itemized accounting of that stipend," Eleanor said. "It comes to a total of $748,612.42. We are formally presenting Mr. Croft with this bill." A gasp went through the courtroom. Julian looked like he had been struck by lightning. His face was a mask of utter, uncomprehending horror. He looked at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time in 5 years he was seeing me not as his caretaker, not as his bank, but as his creditor. The power in the room didn't just shift, it reversed polarity with the force of an explosion. The judge picked up the itemized bill I had prepared. She looked at it, then at Julian, then back at the bill. And for the first time, her impassive expression broke. A corner of her mouth twitched, just for a second. It was the barest hint of a smile. The charade was over, and he had lost. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Julian's claim for alimony was dismissed with prejudice, meaning he could never file it again. Judge Miller called his claim frivolous and frankly insulting to the court's intelligence. She validated the prenup in its entirety, including the lifestyle stipend clause. The $748,000 became a legal judgment against him, to be paid from his share of the marital assets. The problem for Julian was there were hardly any marital assets to divide. I had owned our home before the marriage, and thanks to my father's foresight, my investment accounts and my salary were legally my separate property. His share amounted to a few pieces of art he'd bought and the value of one of our cars. It was a pittance, not even a tenth of what he now owed me. He walked out of that courtroom, a ruined man. The aftermath was quiet. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I just felt light. A weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The psychic burden of his resentment and my guilt had been lifted. I sold the penthouse apartment within a month. I couldn't stand the memories it held, the ghost of his entitled presence in every room. I bought a smaller, warmer place for myself, a brownstone with a small garden in the back. I filled it with books, with art that I loved, with comfortable furniture that you could actually sit on. I filled it with my own life. I heard about Julian through the grapevine. He had to declare bankruptcy. He sold his fancy car, his watches, his wine collection. It still wasn't enough. In the end, he had to move back home, into his childhood bedroom in his parents' house in the suburbs. He was in his 40s, living with his mom and dad. The last I heard, he had finally gotten a job, an entry-level sales position at a company that sold office supplies. The irony was not lost on me. The man whose personal brand was too good for a partner track position was now selling paper clips and toner cartridges. He got what he deserved, I suppose. Not ruin, but reality. A reality he had spent a decade and nearly $1 million of my dollars trying to avoid. Looking back, it wasn't really about the money. I never even tried to collect the full judgment from him. I knew it was impossible. It was about the principle. It was about reclaiming the truth of my own life. He tried to write a story in which I was the villain, the cold-hearted career woman who had failed him. I simply forced him to read the story he had written for himself, the one where he was the author of his own failure. I took back my narrative. I worked hard for my success. I sacrificed sleep, holidays, and a normal social life to become the best surgeon I could be. My work wasn't a weapon I used against my marriage. It was a gift, one that I was, for a time, willing to share. He didn't just take it for granted. He tried to punish me for it. So I'm sharing this with you today, not as a story of revenge, but as a story of reclamation. It's about understanding your own worth, not just emotionally, but financially. It's about drawing boundaries, not to keep people out, but to protect the life you've built. He called me selfish, but was it selfish to protect myself from a parasite? Was it selfish to refuse to fund a lie? I don't think so. I think it was the sanest thing I've ever done. So I have to ask you, what do you think? Did my prenup go too far, or did he get a taste of the accountability he had avoided for so long? I truly want to know what you would have done in my shoes. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight to reclaim your own narrative, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories. Thank you for listening.